Hi, everyone, and a huge welcome to the third edition of Headless Commerce Summit. It is so good to be back in person. A quick intro, I'm Chris Bach. I'm from across the pond, not the big one, and I hope that I'm pointing west, but the small one, and I hope I'm pointing east. I'm originally from Copenhagen, Denmark. I spent 15 years in agencies before moving to Silicon Valley in 2014 to co-found Netlify, a web developer platform. And I want to start with a big thank you. There's, for some reason, 6 other events going on right now, so it's really lovely to see so many of you both here in front of me and following along online. And for all the people standing in the back, there's actually a few seats up here if you want to have a comfortable seat. So I welcome you to do that. And so, all right, we have some spectacular talks over the next couple of days where we'll be taking a deep dive into one of my favorite topics, which is e-commerce. It is a very timely discussion as well. In the last few years, we've seen more than a 10x growth in e-commerce than in the prior decade. And mind you, this was already a really fast-growing category. And there still, today, remains a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity with 81% of commerce still being analog. But it is not just sales volume that's exploding. We're also seeing a massive change in how we build commerce solutions as well. Specifically, we're seeing a huge shift towards headless or composable commerce. In fact, 79% of surveyed tech leaders, according to the latest Mark report, want to increase composable elements into their architecture in the next 12 months. And Forrester said that more than 50% of the incoming queries around DXPs are on composability. So, what is composable commerce? And what is a monolith to begin with? Well, Joe Sigmund, a senior analyst at Forrester, shared this a few days ago as the most accurate depiction of a monolith in a single picture that he's seen. And I kind of like it, so I brought it. Essentially, it's taking a lot of different functionality, often none of it best in class, then putting it in one big solution, where if you want to change one part, you need to change all of them. Only that takes years, and now you've already spent millions, so you don't. No, I'm kidding. Not really. Right, so headless commerce is where instead of running your e-commerce solution in its entire monolith, you cut off the head. No, it's not that violent at all. All it really means is that you take the front end, the web experience layer, and then you decouple and run it separately from the monolith. However, today we're also, I think this is maybe falling off a little bit, can you hear me? Great. Today, we're also starting to massively adopt headless versions of content management systems and lots of APIs like standalone search, etc. And so we're really starting to talk about composable architecture instead, where the goal is more to move away from the monolith in its entirety. That's also why next time we do this summit, we'll be calling it Composable Commerce Summit instead of Headless. Now, in the last 2 summits, that were all virtual, we focused on commerce moving off legacy towards headless, right? That was sort of the headline. But today, the reality is we stand in a place where that wave is already at a point of no return. And I want to double click on the composable commerce category in itself as it's rapidly evolving. And there are way more than one approach or one component to this. So, at Netlify, we provide the platform that sort of ties all the composable parts together into a single developer workflow. Now, already back in 2014, we took a big bet that this was where the web was headed, and since then, we've onboarded close to 3 million developers and businesses to our platform, and we run countless of thousands of composable commerce solutions in all shapes and sizes. So we get to see just firsthand just how rapidly evolving the commerce category is, and we see a lot of discussion on the ins and outs. So in order to make it a little easier to talk to, we've divided the composable commerce landscape into 3 main pillars: storefronts, product experience, and the transactional layer. Now, storefronts are essentially specialized services that are used to build out your front end for your commerce solution. Now, these can be used as part of a pure composable commerce solution, though often we see it used on top of monoliths. For example, a monolithic install of Shopify. Now they range from, a more no-code site builder approach of a Shogun to a a much more yes code developer first approach like Vue Storefront, but it is a rapidly growing space and lots of new exciting solutions are coming up all the time. Now, next up is product experience, and here we have a number of subcategories. So of course we have content management, we have standalone search like Algolia or Search.io, we have DAMS, or that's digital asset management services like Binder or Cloudinary, who we'll be hearing from later at the summit. And of course we also have PIMS or product information management system like Akeneo, who are also presenting actually right after me, and Salsify. And then we have tools and services around personalization, and last, of course, we have reviews. Now, for the last pillar, well, it ain't commerce if there ain't no Muller. Basically, this is, of course, the transactional layer, and it includes order management, pricing, payments, and checkout services. Right, so now, of course, you don't need all of these parts to do e-commerce, but each pillar, I would say, must be represented. You do need some sort of visual representation, right? You do need some product information, and you do need to accept payment. To sum this landscape might, even though it's a very simplified version here, of course, seem overwhelming, right? Do you really need all that for every single project? And first of all, no, you don't. Right? There are many different ways to go about composable commerce. But before we get into that, let's start looking at why composable architecture and composable commerce is becoming the default that it really is. So a primary reason is faster time to market. When I speak to CMOs, both in Europe and in the US, they tell me that their number one challenge is time to market. And it's no wonder. We now live in an age where most business problems have digital solutions. And that rhymes incredibly poorly with an AEM IT admin making business critical decisions. So with traditional commerce solution, you're not only choosing commerce tools, but also template engine, Blue Code, build tool, programming languages, you name it, right? You have traditional server environments with Apache and whatnot that needs maintaining, complex edge infrastructure, varnish caching, and so on. And the result is most likely that it's completely different teams working on those, right? And you will lose tons of productivity not being able to share tools and workflows across these projects. And if it's part of a larger digital experience platform, a DXP, it even defines the adjacent software that you need to use for analytics, content management, you name it, right? And DXPs, just spend a moment on that, they take all this diverse functionality and package up into a large monolithic digital experience platform. Now, the idea of integrating all the data and events around the entire e-commerce funnel was and arguably is spot on, but it was the wrong technical approach. The large monolith becomes bloated and ungovernable, and this approach kills iteration speed, and it excessively adds time to production. So a while ago, I sat down with the marketing department of one of the largest companies in the world. Now, they had spent millions on a legacy DXP, but they were left with a lead time between when marketing had something ready to go and having it implemented and checked all the checks and balances of 32 business days. 32 days. Not really real-time marketing, is it? So, a huge benefit of going composable is enabling your team to ship features 10 times faster. Now, another benefit is cost reduction. It's simply expensive to keep doing things the old way. Now, a quarter of IT decision makers said that they spent over half of their budgets on version upgrades of their legacy systems. On average, companies spend almost 2/5 of their budgets on these kinds of upgrades. That's ridiculous. Now, another part of cost reduction, I was speaking to a CMO recently, and he told me that his provider of a well-known legacy DXP had sold him, and I quote, "Everything I need and everything I don't." The beauty of a composable approach is that you buy or build only what you need. Adopting one module doesn't carry the cost of having to buy everything else. Great. So now we come to omnichannel, right? And composable architecture really enables omnichannel to a much larger degree. So here is a chart by Forrester that really shows just how elaborate our channel distribution is today, if you think of it, right? Now, a traditional monolith makes it virtually impossible to cater all of these different channels customers use today. Every place we share data from, needs to be accessible as an API. And the vastly different presentation layers need to be decoupled in order to build the best experiences for each channel. Now, catering omnichannel shoppers has also become hugely important for retailers today as they spend way more. Now, Target reports that, and they have 40 million guests shopping across channels, and omnichannel guests spend 4 times as much as in-store guests only. Albertsons shares that omnichannel households spend 3 times more than in-store only shoppers, and that in the last 2 years, omnichannel households grew by nearly 5x. And finally, Macy's report that even in a heavy mall-based environment, the omnichannel customer will spend 2.5 to 3.5 times more than a single channel customer. These are huge numbers, right? So I think it's fair to say that embracing omnichannel is do or die for retailers. And the only way to scale that is to move on monolith to a composable architecture. However, arguably the biggest reason for moving to a composable commerce is what it isn't. It is not the web presence. It is not the template engine, it's not the build tool, the glue code, the runtime. Those pieces and all the technical decisions behind them remain entirely under your control. So you can match the technology in use on your site to your team and other projects. Now this matters tremendously for a number of reasons. Now one is a challenge for e-commerce, and this is e-commerce in general, composable, legacy, doesn't matter, is that you don't have the same possibilities for creating an immersive, standout customer experience as you do in a physical store. POS materials, tactile impressions, smells, sounds, face-to-face attention, right? All those things you can do in store, and they're all replaced with, well, graphics on a screen, right? And so instead, we have thousands of stores like yours just a click away. So it becomes very, very important to do what you can to create unique brand experiences for your users. With your headless commerce provider being an API and focused on the transactional tooling, you can now independently create the web application. And you're not bound by certain templates or checkout procedures, but you're free to customize the customer experience to your own exact specifications. Again, while being able to use the modern tools, workflows, and platforms selected by your team to get the job done the fastest. Now, another huge benefit, and for many the main one, is speed, right? E-commerce managers already know the value of every millisecond. There's really no one thing you can do that would have a greater impact on conversion and revenue than to make your site load faster. 56% of customers will leave any websites that take 3 seconds or more to start loading. And it's even worse on mobile, which now accounts for considerably more than half of all visits. And 20%, well, they never return. So this survey for Deloitte shows how every 100 milliseconds of site speed gives you an 8% increase of conversion. However, the average time to first byte for legacy sites is a gut-wrenching 3 seconds, and the average site on mobile takes 27 seconds until it's fully loaded. So it's clear that the web community has a lot of work to do when it comes to performance. Now, luckily, because of the flexibility from headless APIs, we can now have a dramatic impact on performance by replacing the web servers between your customers and the backend systems with a much more hyper-dynamic approach using Jamstack. When you use Jamstack, here shown with a basic Netlify diagram, your commerce APIs connect to a build process where pages are generated and optimized in advance, then shipped to nodes all over the globe. Coupled with using serverless functions API and now also advanced edge functionality, these pre-built pages load content to the screen incredibly fast because they remove all the latency of having to go a round trip or back to the origin somewhere in another country where the pages still have to be assembled before being served. So you're getting the fastest way possible to get your products in front of your visitors, eyeballs, with consistent sub-second response times. You can actually tell in 95% of cases when you're browsing a headless Jamstack site, because it really feels very, very fast, and the page transitions are pretty much instantaneous. I would say more than 95% of the time where I see something really fast and I go to Webalizer and look at the stack, it is indeed served with these best principles. Okay, so another reason is security. Using the best principles of this Jamstack and this composable approach means that you build to separate it from the live site itself. Now that means that you're abstracting away the largest surface area of attack that you have. The vast majority of automated malware in the world is targeted against traditional monoliths, simply because the build process is constantly running and exposed, and it has to cater all these edge use cases, right? So at Netlify, we get hundreds of millions requests a month that alone starts with WP admin. Like, just malware knocking on our door saying, hey, if you happen to have a WordPress install that hasn't been updated for a week or two, we'd love to infect it. and so, this is actually a really good reminder that if you are using WordPress, then for the love of God, use a headless version. But at any rate, you can say that composable architecture served via the Jamstack takes our web solutions from being secure by design at best to secure by default. Now, this approach also means a much better scale, right? It goes without saying, but if you have properties with multiple points of origin, it doesn't need the same build cycle of a monolith. It'll also scale a lot better. If your web properties all of a sudden get on the front page of New York Times or whatever, you don't need to have a huge and expensive server infrastructure up front to cater the spike in traffic. And lastly here, right, and some of you might think that this looks like a strange slide, but the fact of the matter is that good developers are in high demand, and they want to work with modern tools. I was speaking to a chief architect for one of the largest FMCGs a while back, and he shared that they lost a developer in churn because of their legacy stack every week. So, there are, in other words, a lot of good reasons why you need to embrace composable commerce. So how can you go about it, right? Now, there are many ways to roam. Someone once said, I think, we're in London, so anyways. You can start, for example, as Pretty Litter did. Now, they originally kept their monolithic install of Shopify, including the checkout experience, but decoupled the front end. Now, they had success with that approach, and then they added Contentful and moved the checkout experience to Recharge, and today they mostly use Shopify for order management. And we actually get to hear all about that journey tomorrow in a Q&A that I'm really looking forward to. You can also dip your toes a little further from the get-go using more components from a composable backend. Flaconi, for example, used a good portion of Commerce Tools backend for product information, order management, and the transactional layer, and fantastic for the front end, as their head of engineering will be sharing all about tomorrow, together with the CPO of Fantastic, so that'll be a good one too. Now, Hilding Anders had a similar approach. They used BigCommerce for their checkout and added more advanced capabilities like personalization from Uniform, as their CTO will be speaking about tomorrow as well. Now, I've actually seen that talk before, and it's really excellent, so I thoroughly recommend that one. Selling Group, who are also here today, they really embraced a full composable stack, right? So they're enabling components to be reused across their company, sharing customer data across platforms using a decoupled customer data platform. So that's going to be a really interesting one. And they're also going to dive into all the challenges, right? This is best practice, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has been super straightforward. And so that's going to be a great talk as well. And the list goes on. For example, we'll also have a Q&A with Chili's water bottles, who build around Commerce Layer, which is a commerce solution with a very specific focus on the transactional layer. So that's going to be super interesting. So regardless of your approach, as you move into composable commerce, there are a few things that go for all solutions. Now, we already talked about it, right? But for the web experience, always use the best practices of the Jamstack. If you just pair it with a monolithic legacy website, you're going to miss out on most of the benefits of going composable. Can't stress that enough. Now, another thing here that's really interesting is that the traditional way of adopting new software, whether it's web or software, right, is to build it out, port over the content, and then perhaps a few years later, you flip the switch and you go live. This is typically a main reason for staying put on your legacy system. Simply because so much have gone into it, that it seems daunting to go anywhere else. However, once you go composable, one of my favorite parts is that you can do so gradually. As an example, at Netlify, we can proxy to your legacy app or your new page for every visitor without any performance loss. So with a composable stack, it's easy and quick to slice out a page, and then you can publish a new project within weeks instead of what used to be months or years. And the fact that you can, for example, just change your checkout page without changing your entire solution is a real game changer. Now, as you start to adopt composable architecture across your organization, right? You're no longer just doing it for a single project. You want to make sure that you're not building out another monolith in your attempt to tie together all those new APIs and components and services. And this is something I really see with clients that are quite mature and have a lot of teams and have started really sort of diving into composable architecture as the way they built for anything that's served over the web. Now, you don't want to build out an operational spider web on AWS, right? I mean, the idea here is to free your developers from needing heavy DevOps to deploy. This is super important as well, right? And try to make sure that you don't integrate too heavily into the modules that you want to be interchangeable as you go along, right? I mean, a great example here is JavaScript frameworks, right? So it's an area of web development with very high iteration. And so I think everyone remembers that it was all Angular until one morning apparently it was React, right? And then Gatsby was super popular a few years ago, and then next, and now there's all this hype around Remix, and who knows what it'll be a year from now. But a funny story here is actually when my co-founder and I, we did a job interview of a web developer a few years ago, and I think Matt asked him sort of what he thought about some of the latest JavaScript framework, and he answered, "I don't know, I've been on vacation for the last 3 weeks." And you know, it's fairly saying here, right? So the last part you really need is some organizational maturity, right? There's no way around this. A composable stack enables best-in-class functionality for all your needs, but there are more components, and you do need to be a bit more intentional with your architecture, especially as you scale. And then, quite frankly, you need to be able to call BS, right? I mean, as composable architecture is winning out, you see tons of vendors calling their services Mark ready or composable when they're obviously not, right? And sure, some of the legacy DXP are technically becoming a bit more modular, but they're not natively composable, right? And they are only meant to work with other modules provided by the same software vendor. So yeah, being able to watch out for that, right, and argue around it is really important. So, when it comes to web and software in general, we experience both a constant evolution, and then once in a decade or so, we see more of a sudden shift. Now I believe that this move to a composable architecture in the Jamstack and its rapid pace of adoption is such a shift. It's an absolute incredible time to be in web development. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to all our sponsors, partners, and clients that have come here to share their stories. Now, let's have a wonderful summit. Thank you, everyone. Bye.